The ex-slaves were called freed men, and the freedmen of the Indians had reason to dance. No, they weren't rich, but since they were now citizens of the tribe, and the tribe owned all the land, there was no need to sharecrop. Just stake a claim, build a cabin, start a farm. And there was the black vote. Witness this Seminole election in which they counted one candidate's supporters on the left side of the street, the other candidates on the right. To gain control of the Cherokee capital in Tahlequah, chiefs like Lewis Downing campaigned heavily for the black vote, as did Chief Spaichi for control of the Creek capital in Okmulgee.
The Creeks appointed and elected blacks as judges, attorneys. They were private secretaries. They were members of the council. And of course, the 3 black towns in the Creek Nation had representatives in both the House of Kings and House of Warriors.
Silas Jefferson was even elected one of the Creek chiefs and was among the delegation any time that the Creeks had business in Washington. Since there was none of the lynchings or terror of the white South, Indian Territory became a mecca for blacks, even though many never gained citizenship. At least 25 black towns sprang up, some still around, like Taft, Redbird, and Tallahassee, where on a warm day they still bring out the kitchen table for a game of dominoes.
I'm out of here.
What?
How you get down? I'm out of here.
I'm glad you did.
There were black lawmen among the Creek Nation Light Horse Police, deputy U.S. Marshals like Bass Reeves, who killed 14 outlaws without ever being wounded. And there were outlaws, killers like Cherokee Bill, part black, part Cherokee, or the Buck Rufus gang of Creeks and Creek freedmen. And there were the rowdies.
If they got enough whiskey in them, why they shoot town up.
You ever had to run from a shoot up?
I half crawled on the bed.
My great-great-uncle Willis was among those rowdies. You may recall my great-grandmother Phyllis Pettit's story of how her husband's mother was sold by his Cherokee master.
He looked down a long lane after her just as long as he could see her and cried after her.
While George Pettit turned out okay, his brother Willis spent 1877 in the National Prison for shooting up the capital of Tahlequah. 5 years later, it was more serious. In March 1882, the Cherokee Advocate reported in both English and Cherokee, murder trial in Tahlequah, the capital, the Cherokee Nation versus Willis Pettit. The transcript still exists today. It seems 2 weeks earlier, Willis was having an argument with his wife Julia when his mother-in-law, Margaret Bird, said something, so he shot her. It all happened in the home of a sick woman that the 2 women were visiting. Among the numerous witnesses was one Henry Bowe, who testified that the day of the murder, Willis had tried to sell him his house and his hogs for $65. He said his wife had quit him. I said to him, "That won't make you sell your place. She'll come back again." He said to me, "That's played out," and he cursed and said, "I'm going to kill Margaret." While Willis did not take the stand, he had a witness, Maria Shepherd, support his defense that Margaret was trying to kill him. "As I passed her along the road," testified Maria, "she said she would have Willis put away in less time than 2 weeks. But the Cherokee transcripts say the prosecutor asked Maria, "What relation are you to Pettit?" "Not any." "Is Willis not in the habit of coming to your house often?" "He comes there sometimes." "How come Margaret to tell you about this?" "She did not like Willis and did not like me." "Why is it that Margaret Bird did not like Willis and you?" "I do not want to tell about that. I am not going to tell it." The Cherokee Advocate reported, the jury returned a verdict of murder, and Willis, that is his name, was sentenced to be hung until he was dead, dead, dead on the 5th of May next. At a hanging in those days, the public came to watch, and the condemned man was among those expected to make a speech to warn some young person against making the same mistake. The newspaper reported Willis went to the gallows laughing. As for his last words, he said he'd made a mistake. He meant to shoot his wife, Julia.
One, her.
The Oklahoma Land Rush was the beginning of the end for the 5 Indian republics. 1889, Congress had given to anybody fast enough to grab it much of the land confiscated from the tribes who'd supported the South in the Civil War. 9 years later, Congress made the Indian governments irrelevant by taking title to the land they still held and sending in the Dawes Commission to split it up and allot it as private farms to the individual Indians and freedmen who were members of the tribes. At mass gatherings like this, they were interviewed to determine whether they were legitimate tribal members or squatters. In the Cherokee Nation, folks like my grandmother, Letitia Ford, had no trouble proving their legitimacy and received deeds to their land. She received 60 acres. My grandpa, John Ford, was a non-citizen but had access to land through Letitia and their children. The Fords, John's parents, Harry and Zerilda, had migrated from Kentucky in the 1870s, but Zerilda had died, and Harry had remarried a Creek freedman woman, gaining access to land as well. But some of the blacks had no connections, had not married citizens, but had established farms on tribal lands. Now, somebody was about to receive an allotment that included their farms. In the Tallahassee community and the Creek Nation, many of them turned for help to great-grandpa Harry Ford, a Baptist minister, and, says his 85-year-old surviving son Andrew, a prominent farmer.
My dad had a big barn, load full of hay, corn. He once had sharecroppers.
But he didn't have gas lights, and that proved tragic when he came to Washington, D.C. that day, seeking someone in authority to help his neighbors keep their land. The October 19th, 1906 Evening Star reported the story. It said he took a cab to a hotel called the Philadelphia House at 348 Pennsylvania Avenue, which is where the National Gallery of Art now is. It said he asked questions around the hotel. Quote, the visitor said he wanted to meet some Baptist ministers in this city as he thought they might assist him to transact some important business in which he was interested. Then he went to bed in a room which had a gas light. My Uncle John Ford picks up the story.
Instead of him turning it out, he blew it out, and he became asphyxiated. Then the rumors are that he was really on to something, you know, that was going to benefit blacks, and maybe it was foul play.
Somebody killed him.
Yes, now that was a rumor.
The D.C. death certificate said Harry Ford, age 70s, cause of death, asphyxia.
He had $1,000 more when he left home. When he got it back, he didn't have a dime on him nowhere. Naturally wouldn't have. In the cheapest casket they could buy, and shipped him back to Oklahoma.
As for the blacks Harry was trying to help, they lost out. But all of his and his second wife's descendants received 160 acres of Creek land. They became targets for rip-offs by land speculators. And when oil was discovered on Harry's grandson Dan's land, he was essentially kidnapped.
Dan, they run him way out towards California trying to make him sell his place and all that. They called them land grafters.
Dan was no fool. He refused. Andrew said when oil was discovered on his allotment, he had no problem with land grafters, but later both he and Dan lost their wealth.
That's when they got Dan Tucker. The banks went busted and cleaned our ass out.
The end of Indian Territory meant the end of an era, of 40 years of tribal citizenship for blacks, the end of centuries of self-rule for the proud tribes, the Choctaws, Chickasaws, Cherokees, Creeks, and Seminoles. The descendants of those black slaves and red masters after this.